This video is about the death of the petrodollar, a financial arrangement that quietly ran the world for 50 years and is now coming apart. Pull a dollar bill out of your wallet and what you are holding is cotton and linen fiber worth almost nothing in physical terms, and yet farmers in Brazil accept it, oil sheiks in Saudi Arabia accept it, and factory workers in China accept it because the entire world has agreed to believe in it. That belief is the whole story. Not economics, not printing presses, not interest rates, belief. And what created that belief was power. Specifically, one very clever deal made in the desert heat of 1974 that gave the American dollar a second life just when it was dying. That deal is what we call the petrodollar system. And after 50 years of running the global economy, that system is cracking. Not in a dramatic Hollywood way, something slower and honestly more dangerous than that. A quiet structural unraveling that touches your savings, your retirement, and the price of everything you bring home. So let's go through the whole story from the beginning. To understand what the petrodollar is, you need to understand what came before it, because nothing in history materializes from nowhere. Go back to 1944, with World War II still ongoing, and 44 allied nations sending representatives to a small resort town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, where they struck a deal that shaped everything afterward. The entire global financial system would be built around the American dollar. All other currencies would be pegged to it. And the dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, meaning every currency in the world was effectively backed by gold through the dollar. The reason everyone agreed was straightforward. America was the only major economy that had not been gutted by the war. And at that moment, the country held more than half the world's gold reserves. So trusting its currency made genuine sense. For about 25 years, the arrangement delivered exactly what it promised. The global economy rebuilt, trade expanded, and the dollar became the language of international commerce. The problem that developed was also simple. America started spending more money than it had, with the Vietnam War and large domestic programs driving chronic deficits. And other countries began questioning whether the dollar was really backed by as much gold as Washington claimed. France called the bluff. First President de Gaulle physically shipped dollars back to the United States and demanded gold in return. His message being straightforward: prove it. Other nations followed, and America's gold reserves started draining out. A French official named Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had already given the dollar's structural advantage a name in the 1960s, calling it the exorbitant privilege, meaning America could print the world's reserve currency, run up debts, buy foreign goods, fund wars, and finance anything it wanted, while the rest of the world absorbed those dollars just to participate in global trade. That's the privilege, the ability to live beyond your means with other countries, absorbing the costs, and by the late 1960s, those other countries were getting tired of paying for it. On the evening of August 15th, 1971, President Nixon went on television and suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold, ending Bretton Woods unilaterally, backing the dollar with nothing beyond trust in the US government, and dissolving the world's financial rules overnight. Historians call this the Nixon shock, and it was a genuine crisis. The dollar dropped, inflation climbed, and currencies lurched around chaotically. Every American leader now faced the same question: how do you keep the world using a currency with nothing behind it? The answer came 2 years later from a direction almost nobody had anticipated. October 1973 brought the Yom Kippur War, and when the United States sided with Israel, the Arab members of OPEC responded with an oil embargo that hit American consumers with something close to a gut punch. Gas stations ran dry, lines stretched around blocks, and the price of oil climbed from roughly $3 a barrel to around $12 a barrel by early 1974, a fourfold increase in a matter of months. All that additional money flowing into Arab treasuries had to go somewhere, and countries like Saudi Arabia were suddenly holding far more dollars than a population of a few million could absorb domestically. These surplus earnings became known as petrodollars, dollars earned from selling petroleum, and the United States recognized in them a potential lifeline for a currency that had just lost its gold backing. The strategic logic followed from there. Get OPEC countries to price oil in dollars. Get them to recycle their surplus dollars back into American financial markets. And you have replaced gold as the foundation of the currency. You have backed the dollar not with a metal sitting in a vault, but with energy, the one commodity every country on earth burns every single day. Treasury Secretary William Simon traveled to Saudi Arabia, and on June 8, 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed the Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation, a framework for deepening economic ties, channeling Saudi investment into American projects, and providing American arms and security guarantees to Riyadh. Alongside that formal agreement, historical accounts consistently describe an informal understanding that Saudi Arabia would continue pricing its oil in dollars and route its surplus dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds and American financial assets. A word here on the viral story that circulated widely in 2024, claiming that a secret 50-year petrodollar treaty between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia had expired. Fact checkers and historians who examined government records found no evidence of any formal treaty requiring Saudi Arabia to price oil exclusively in dollars. The Joint Commission existed and it lapsed, but it carried no such clause. The informal arrangement was real. The mythology wrapped around it was exaggerated, and the actual truth turns out to be more interesting and more complicated than the legend anyway. With the system in place by the mid-1970s, the engine ran in a way that was genuinely one of the most elegant financial constructions of the modern era. And whether you resent what it did to the world or admire it, the engineering deserves a moment of attention. Step one was that OPEC nations sold oil to the world with all contracts priced in dollars, which meant any country needing energy had to first acquire dollars just to function. Japan needed oil, so Japan needed dollars. Germany needed oil, Germany needed dollars. India, South Korea, Brazil, all of them had to hold dollars to keep their economies running, and that guaranteed a permanent global demand for the currency that no amount of financial maneuvering could easily replace. Step two was petrodollar recycling, the part most people never hear about. Oil exporting countries received enormous dollar flows but couldn't absorb all of it domestically, so the surplus went back into Western banks and American financial markets, mostly U.S. Treasury bonds. Dollars went out to pay for oil, then came back as investment, out and back, like a pump that kept American capital markets flooded with cheap money while keeping global demand for dollars permanently elevated. What America collected from this was the exorbitant privilege running at full strength, lower borrowing costs than any other country, the ability to run large trade deficits, and the capacity to print money for wars and programs without immediately destroying the dollar's value, because global demand absorbed the printing. By 1970, even before the petrodollar arrangement was formalized, around 82% of all global foreign exchange reserves were already held in dollars, and after 1974, that dominance deepened for another 3 decades. The recycling machine had a downstream effect that rarely gets mentioned. Those surplus petrodollars flowing back through American and European banks were lent out to developing countries in enormous syndicated loans, financing infrastructure and growth from Latin America to Asia to Africa. Between 1973 and 1977, the foreign debts of oil importing developing countries rose by 150%, which tells you how much capital was moving through the system as a direct result of this arrangement, with projects like the Itaipu Dam in Brazil built on recycled petrodollar money. Of course, borrowing 150% more in just 4 years set the stage for a debt crisis in the 1980s, but that is its own story. The petrodollar was the hidden architecture of the global economy for 50 years, invisible to most people going about their daily lives, and yet present in every imported purchase, every pension fund return, and every time the US government borrowed money cheaply to run its deficits. Dominance, this complete doesn't get challenged all at once. It erodes at the edges quietly, and that is exactly how the petrodollar's decline began. In the late 1990s, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves sat above 70%. And the arrival of the euro in 1999 gave the financial world its first genuine alternative reserve currency of real scale. Europe was a large, wealthy trading bloc. You could hold euros to conduct European business, the same way you held dollars for oil, and the dollar's reserve share drifted from above 70% towards 60% over the first 2 decades of the 2000s. Nobody raised alarms because the decline was gradual, but it was real and it was consistent. The 2008 global financial crisis deepened the questioning. Countries holding vast reserves in dollar-denominated assets watched American financial institutions nearly collapse, American regulators scramble, and American housing bonds dissolve into garbage. And finance ministries from Beijing to Brasilia started asking whether the dollar's structural advantages were worth the risk exposure. China asked that question louder than anyone, and after 2008, Beijing launched a long project to internationalize the yuan, setting up offshore trading centers, negotiating currency swap agreements with dozens of countries, and building a payment messaging system called CIPS as an alternative to the dollar-dominated SWIFT network. China was laying plumbing for a different world, and it was patient about it. But the data, through all that effort, kept delivering the same verdict. By the late 2010s, the yuan still accounted for only around 2% of global foreign exchange reserves. 2% against the dollar's 60 plus. The infrastructure was being built, the political will was there, and yet the numbers barely moved. The real turning point had not yet arrived, and when it did, it wore the face of a war in Eastern Europe. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 triggered the most sweeping financial sanctions in modern history, and the move that changed the calculus for the entire developing world came when the West froze a massive portion of Russia's foreign currency reserves, savings built up over decades in dollar-denominated assets, simply frozen and inaccessible overnight. Finance ministers in capitals across the developing world watched this happen and drew the same conclusion. The United States can weaponize the dollar. Hold your reserves in dollars, end up in Washington's crosshairs, and those reserves can be cut off overnight. The tool that had been presented for 50 years as a neutral store of national savings turned out to be a political instrument, and that realization, once made, could not be reversed by any reassurance. And this is where it becomes important to understand why that realization mattered so deeply. The petrodollar system had always rested on the belief that the dollar was stable, safe, and politically neutral. The 2022 sanctions demonstrated publicly and permanently that it was none of those things. And once that demonstration had been made in front of every finance ministry on earth, the world could not unsee it. China and Russia accelerated the shift of their bilateral trade into yuan and rubles almost immediately, with Chinese firms buying Russian oil, coal, and energy in yuan rather than dollars. By late 2023, around 1/3 of Russia's entire foreign trade was being settled in yuan, and the yuan had become the most actively traded foreign currency on the Moscow exchange, a complete inversion of what had been the case just a few years before. The ripple extended well beyond Russia and China. On August 14, 2023, India settled its first crude oil payment to the United Arab Emirates using Indian rupees, roughly 1 million barrels of oil changing hands without a single dollar involved. The deal was small in absolute terms, but India is the world's third largest oil importer, and a rupee dirham settlement framework now existed where none had been before, which meant the precedent was set. In December 2022, at the first ever China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit in Riyadh, Chinese President Xi Jinping urged the Gulf monarchies to use the Shanghai Petroleum and natural gas exchange for oil and gas sales denominated in yuan. Around the edges of that same summit, Saudi Arabia and China signed around $30 billion worth of commercial deals, and the direction of the Saudi-China relationship became unmistakable to anyone watching. The BRICS bloc, originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, had carried the rhetorical weight of the developing world's dissatisfaction with a Western-designed financial system for years. And for most of that time, the talk of reducing dollar dependence was exactly that, talk. The 2023 Johannesburg Summit shifted the temperature considerably. 6 new members received invitations at that summit: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina, and the UAE. And 2 of those names deserve a moment of attention. Saudi Arabia was a country whose oil pricing decisions had held the petrodollar together for 50 years, and the UAE was another major Gulf oil exporter, both of them choosing to affiliate with a bloc whose stated agenda included local currency trade was a signal that cut through the noise in ways that previous BRICS statements had not. Brazilian President Lula put the political shift into plain language at that gathering. His words were, "Why can't we do trade based on our own currencies?" Who was it that decided that the dollar was the currency after the disappearance of the gold standard? A decade earlier, a statement like that from the leader of a major economy would have been whispered in a back corridor at the 2023 BRICS Summit. It came from a podium in front of the world's cameras. The summit stopped well short of creating a common BRICS currency, because the economic and political differences among the member states made that far too complicated to attempt, but it issued a declaration encouraging local currency trade, and the expansion to include major oil producers gave the de-dollarization conversation a credibility it had never previously carried. October 2023 brought what was reported as the first crude oil purchase settled in digital yuan, the ECNY, through the Shanghai International Energy Exchange government-issued digital currency used to buy physical oil, a genuinely new development in the history of commodity markets. And then in June 2024, Saudi Arabia joined the mBridge project, a central bank digital currency platform led by China and the Bank for International Settlements, designed specifically for cross-border settlements using digital currencies. Saudi Arabia joining Bridge. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar for 50 years, represented a meaningful shift in posture. Even if analysts correctly noted that large-scale yuan-denominated oil settlements through such a system would take years to build, a clear-eyed look at the numbers matters here, because a lot of coverage treats each new bilateral currency deal as confirmation that the dollar is finished, and that conclusion is not what the data supports. The International Monetary Fund's reserve currency figures tell a story of real but gradual change. From above 70% in the late 1990s, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves had declined to around 57 to 58% by 2024, and early 2025, a genuine sustained decline over 25 years. But 57% still represents roughly 2 to 3 times the share held in euros, the next largest reserve currency. The renminbi, despite decades of Chinese effort and enormous investment in promotion, sat at around 2.1% of global reserves. Against the dollar's 57, the yuan held 2. That gap doesn't close quickly, no matter how many bilateral deals get signed. Oil pricing tells a similar story. The cases we describe, India and the UAE settling in rupees, China and Russia trading in yuan, are real and growing, but in aggregate, most oil contracts around the world are still priced and settled in dollars, SWIFT payment data shows the dollar running at around 45 to 50% of international payments by value, with the euro at roughly 20 to 25% and the yuan sitting in the low single digits, somewhere between 2 and 5%, depending on how you measure it. 6 years ago, the yuan share was even smaller. So yes, the trajectory runs in one direction, but the gap between the dollar and everything else remains vast. Eurostat data for 2023 showed that for extra EU imports, which include a large share of oil, the dollar appeared in about 50% of transactions against the euro's 41%. Federal Reserve research found the dollar accounting for around 96% of trade invoicing in the Americas, 74% in the Asia-Pacific region, and 79% elsewhere outside Europe. These shares are built on decades of network effects, and they don't flip on the back of a summit declaration. Stripped of both the panic and the dismissal, the honest picture runs like this. The petrodollar is eroding in a real and structural way. The dollar is moving from monopoly toward a world with more competition. And anyone telling you the currency is finished has not looked at the numbers. What's accurate is that a decline from 70% to 57% of global reserves over 25 years represents trillions of dollars of national savings that have shifted elsewhere, and that trend, sustained over another generation, carries genuine consequences for American borrowing costs, consumer prices, and the government's ability to finance its deficits cheaply. The most concrete and measurable signal of all doesn't show up in yuan payment statistics or BRICS declarations. It shows up in gold, and the numbers are extraordinary. Central banks collectively bought 1,082 tons of gold in 2022, a record for any single year ever recorded. They followed that with about 1,037 tons in 2023 and roughly 1,045 tons in 2024, making 3 consecutive years above 1,000 tons and extending a 15-year streak of net buying that dates all the way back to 2010. Before 2010, central banks had been net sellers of gold for decades. That reversal has now persisted for a decade and a half, with the pace accelerating sharply after 2022. Gold pays no interest, carries no yield, and costs money to store. So central banks, accepting those costs, are making a deliberate statement about what they want in their reserves, an asset that cannot be frozen, cannot be sanctioned, and cannot be controlled from Washington. And the single event that analysts point to as the biggest accelerant of this buying trend is the 2022 freezing of Russian reserves. After watching dollar assets disappear overnight, reserve managers across emerging markets reached the same conclusion and acted on it in record quantities. What central banks do with their national savings is the most honest signal available about how the most sophisticated institutional money in the world views the dollar's future. And for 15 years, with a sharp acceleration after 2022, that signal has pointed toward gold. The petrodollar, as it existed from 1974 to roughly 2022, is dying, not dead. And the difference between those two conditions carries real weight. Picture a tree that dominated the forest for 50 years, its roots running everywhere, its canopy so thick that nothing else could grow beneath it. That tree is still standing. It's still the largest tree in the forest. But the canopy has thinned, other trees are finally getting sunlight, and the forest is slowly changing around it. What has genuinely changed is measurable. More oil and energy trade is now settled in non-dollar currencies than at any point since 1974. The infrastructure for non-dollar settlements, CPIS, MemBridge, bilateral currency swap lines, the digital yuan exists today in ways it simply didn't a decade ago. Central banks have delivered 3 consecutive record-breaking years of gold purchases, demonstrating through their own reserves decisions that they no longer regard the dollar as the unchallenged, safe place to hold national wealth, and the political language around reducing dollar dependence from BRICS summits to presidential speeches carries a seriousness it never held before. What has not changed is equally measurable. The dollar holds 57% of global reserves against the yuan's 2.1%, Oil is still predominantly priced in dollars. SWIFT payments still flow predominantly in dollars. China's capital controls continue limiting yuan appeal to foreign investors who want open access to their money. And the dollar's network effect, everyone uses it because everyone else uses it, doesn't dissolve because of a digital yuan pilot or a bilateral rupee deal. For anyone living in the United States, even a gradual transition away from dollar monopoly carries real consequences. A declining share of global dollar demand means gradually higher borrowing costs for the US government. The exorbitant privilege, that structural advantage Giscard d'Estaing resented in the 1960s, gets slowly and persistently reduced. The lifestyle that dollar dominance helps subsidize, from cheap imported goods to low mortgage rates to an endlessly financeable national debt, faces real pressure over time. Nobody knows exactly how fast this goes. China will keep pushing the yuan through bridge bilateral currency deals and yuan-denominated commodity futures because this is a deliberate, decades-long strategic project with resources and patience behind it. Saudi Arabia will keep hedging, one foot in the dollar world through its currency peg and sovereign wealth fund, one foot in the non-dollar world through BRICS membership and mBridge participation and ongoing yuan oil discussions. Whether Riyadh eventually makes a decisive break or pulls back from the experiment will be one of the most consequential decisions in international finance over the next decade. But the thing that doesn't get said often enough is this. The petrodollar system was built on a belief, the belief that the dollar was stable, safe, and politically neutral. When the United States froze Russian reserves in 2022, it proved publicly and permanently that the dollar is not neutral. It is a political weapon. That single demonstration, spreading through every finance ministry and central bank that watched it happen, carries more lasting weight than any individual trade deal or summit declaration. You cannot unring that bell. The petrodollar was born from American creative brilliance at a moment of genuine crisis. An administration facing a dying currency found a way to back it, not with gold sitting in a vault, but with black gold that the whole world burned every single day. For 50 years, that arrangement worked beautifully for the United States. The world now has options, and it is carefully, methodically building the infrastructure to use them. The death of the petrodollar may take another generation to complete, but the process has started. An understanding that from the actual history and the actual data, rather than a panicked headline, is what real financial clarity looks like in the 21st century.